Chapter 5. How Help Came to the King. But his misery did not last long. Almost at once there came a bump, then a second bump, and 2 children were standing before him. The wood in front of him had been quite empty a second before, and he knew they had not come from behind his tree, for he would have heard them. They had in fact simply appeared, out of nowhere. He saw at a glance they were wearing the same queer, dingy sort of clothes as the people in his dream. And he saw at a second glance they were the youngest boy and girl out of that party of 7. "Gosh," said the boy, "that took one's breath away. I thought..." "Hurry up and get him untied," said the girl. "We can talk afterward." And then she added, turning to Tyrion, "I'm sorry we've been so long. We came the moment we could." While she was speaking, the boy produced a knife from his pocket and was quickly cutting the king's bonds. Too quickly, in fact, for the king was so stiff and numb that when the last cord was cut, he fell forward on his hands and knees. He couldn't get up again until he had brought some life back into his legs by a good rubbing. "I say," said the girl, "it was you, wasn't it, who appeared to us that night when we were all at supper, nearly a week ago?" "A week, fair maid," said Tyrion. "My dream led me into your world scarce 10 minutes since." "It's the usual muddle about times, Pole," said the boy. "I remember now," said the Tyrion. "That too comes in the old tales. The time of your strange land is different from ours. But if we speak of time, 'tis time to be gone from here, for my enemies are close at hand. Will you come with me?" "Of course," said the girl. "It's you we've come to help." Tyrion got to his feet and led them rapidly downhill, southward and away from the stable. He knew where he meant to go, but his first aim was to get to rocky places where they would leave no trail, and his second to cross some water so they would leave no scent. This took them about an hour's scrambling and waiting, and while all that was going on, nobody had any breath to talk. But even so, Tyrion kept on stealing glances at his companions. The wonder of walking beside the creatures from another world made him feel a little dizzy. But it also made all the old stories seem far more real than I had ever seemed before. Anything might happen now. "Now," said Tyrion as they came to the head of a little valley which ran down before them among the young birch trees, "we are out of danger of those villains for a space, and may walk more easily." The sun had risen. Dewdrops were twinkling on every branch, and the birds were singing. "What about some grub? I mean for you, sir. We too have had our breakfast," said the boy. Tyrion wondered very much what he meant by grub, but when the boy opened a bulgy satchel which he was carrying and pulled out a rather greasy and squashy packet, he understood. He was ravenously hungry, and though he hadn't thought about it till that moment. There were 2 hard-boiled egg sandwiches, and 2 cheese sandwiches, and 2 with some kind of paste in them. If he hadn't been so hungry, he wouldn't have thought much of the paste, for it is the sort of food that nobody eats in Narnia. By the time he'd eaten all 6 sandwiches, they had come to the bottom of the valley, and they had found a mossy cliff with a little fountain bubbling out of it. All 3 stopped, and drank, and splashed their hot faces. "And now," said the girl, as she tossed her wet hair back from her forehead, "aren't you going to tell us who you are, and why you were tied up, and what this is all about?" "With a good will, damsel," said Tyrion, "but we must keep on the march." So while they went on walking, he told them who he was, and all the things that happened to him. "And now," he said at the end, "I am going to a certain tower, one of 3 that were built in my grandsire's time to guard Lantern Waste against certain perilous outlaws who dwelt there in his day. By Aslan's goodwill, I was not robbed of my keys. In that tower we shall find stores of weapons and mail, and some victuals also, though no better than dry biscuit. There also we can lie safe while we make our plans. And now, prithee, tell me who you 2 are, and all your story." "Well, I'm Eustace Scrubb, and this is Jill Pole," said the boy. "And we were here once before, ages and ages ago, more than a year ago by our time, and there's a chap called Prince Rilian, and they were keeping this chap underground, and Puddleglum put his foot in..." "Ha!" cried Tyrion. "Are you then the Eustace and Jill who rescued King Rilian from his long enchantment?" "Yes, that's us," said Jill. So he's king really now, is he? Oh, of course he would be. I forgot. Nay, said Tristan. I am the 7th in descent from him. He has been dead for over 200 years. And Jill made a face. Ugh, she said. That's the horrid thing about coming back to Narnia. But Eustace went on. Well, now you know who we are, sire, he said. And it was like this. And the Professor and Aunt Polly had all got us friends of Narnia together. I know not these names, Eustace, said Tyrion. Oh, well, they're the two who came into Narnia at the very beginning, the day all the animals began to talk. By the lion's mane, cried Tyrion. Those two? The Lord Diggory and Lady Polly, from the dawn of the world, are still alive in your place. Ah, the wonder and glory of it. But tell me. Well, she isn't really our aunt, you know, said Eustace. She's Miss Plummer, but we call her Aunt Polly. Well, those two got us together, partly just for fun, so that we could all have a good job out in Narnia, for, of course, there's no one else we could talk to about things like that. But partly because the Professor had a feeling that we were somehow wanted over here. Well, then you came in like a ghost, or goodness knows what, nearly frightened the lives out of us and vanished without saying a word. And after that, we knew for certain there was something up. The next question was how to get here. You can't go just by wanting to. So we talked, and at last the Professor said the only way would be by the magic rings. It was by those rings that he and Aunt Polly got here long ago when they were only kids, years before we younger ones were even born. But the rings had all been buried in the garden of a house in London. Well, that's our big town, sire. And the house had been sold. So then the problem was how to get at them. You'll never guess what we did in the end. Peter and Edmund, that's the High King Peter, and he's the one who spoke to you. They went up to London to get in the garden from the back early in the morning before people are up, and they were dressed like workmen. So they could say that if anyone did see them, and it would look like they were there to do something about the drains. Ah, I wish I was with them. It must have been glorious fun. And they must have succeeded, for the next day Peter sent us a wire that's a sort of message, sire. I'll explain it some other day. To say that he got the rings. And the day after that was the day Paul and I had to go back to school. And we're the only two who are still at school, and we're the same one. So Peter and Edmund were to meet us at a place on the way down to school and hand over the rings. It had to be us two who were going to Narnia, you see, because the older ones couldn't come again. So we got into the train. That's the kind of thing people travel in our world, and a lot of wagons chained together. And the Professor and Aunt Polly and Lucy came with us. We wanted to keep together as long as we could. Well, there we were in the train, and we were just getting to the station when the others were to meet us, and I was looking out the window to see if I could see them when suddenly there came the most frightful jerk and noise, and there we were, in Narnia. And there was your Majesty tied up to the tree. So you never used the rings, said Tyrion. No, said Eustace. Never even saw them. Aslan did it for us in his own way, without any rings. But the High King Peter has them, said Tyrion. Yes, said Jill, but we don't think he can use them. When the other two Pevensies, King Edmund and Queen Lucy, were last here, Aslan said they would never come to Narnia again. And he said something of the same sort to the High King only longer ago. You may be sure he would come like a shot if allowed to. Gosh, said Eustace, it's getting hot in the sun. Are we nearly there, sire? Look, said Tyrion and pointed. And not many yards away, great battlements rose above the treetops, and after a minute's more walking they came out into an open grassy space. A stream ran across it, and on the far side of the stream stood a squat, square tower with very few and narrow windows and one heavy-looking door in the wall that faced them. Tyrion looked sharply this way and that to make sure no enemies were in sight. Then he walked up to the tower, stood still for a moment, fishing up his bunch of keys which he wore inside his hunting dress on a narrow silver chain that went round his neck. It was a nice bunch of keys that he brought out, for 2 were golden and many were richly ornamented. You could see at once they were keys made for opening solemn and secret rooms in palaces, or chests and caskets of sweet-smelling wood that contained royal treasures. But the key which he now put in the lock of the door was big and plain and more rudely made. The lock was stiff, and for a moment Tyrion began to be afraid he would not be able to turn it. But at last he did, and the door swung open with a sullen creak. "Welcome, friends," said Tyrion. "I fear this is the best palace the King of Narnia can now offer to his guests." Tyrion was pleased to see that the two strangers had been well brought up. They both said not to mention it, and they were sure it was very nice. As a matter of fact, it was not particularly nice. It was rather dark. It smelled very damp. There was only one room in it. The room went right up to the stone roof. A wooden staircase in one corner led to a trapdoor by which you could get out into the battlements. There were a few rude bunks to sleep in, and a great many lockers and bundles. There was also a hearth, which looked as if nobody had lit a fire in it for a great many years. "We'd better go out and gather some wood first thing, hadn't we?" "No, not yet, comrade," said Tyrion. He was determined they would not be caught unarmed, and began searching the lockers, thankfully remembering that he had always been careful to have these garrison towers inspected once a year to make sure they were stocked with all things needful. The bowstrings were in their coverings of oiled silk. The swords and spears were greased against rust, and the armor was kept bright on its wrappings. But there was something even better. "Look," said Tyrion as he drew out a long mail shirt of curious pattern and flashed it before the children's eyes. "Well, that's funny-looking mail, sire," said Eustace. "Aye, lad," said Tyrion, "no Narnian dwarf smithy that. 'Tis mail of Caelerman, outlandish gear. I have ever kept a few suits of it in readiness, for I never knew when I or my friends might have reason to walk unseen in the Tisrock's land. And look on this stone bottle. In it there is a juice which, when we have rubbed it on our hands and faces, will make us brown as Caelermeans." "Oh, hurrah!" said Jill. "Disguise! I love disguises." Tyrion showed them how to pour out a little of the juice on the palms of their hands and rub it in all over their faces and necks, right down to the shoulders, and then onto their hands right up to the elbows. He did the same himself. "After this has hardened on us," he said, "we may wash in water and it will not change. Nothing but oil and ashes will make us white Narnians again. And now, sweet Jill, let us go out and see how this mail shirt becomes you. 'Tis something too long, yet not so much as I feared, and doubtless it belonged to a page in the train of one of the Tarchons." After the mail shirts, they put on Caelermene helmets, which are little round ones fitting tight on the head and having a spike on the top. Then Tyrion took long rolls of some white stuff out of the locker and wound them around the helmets till they looked like turbans, but the little steel spike still stuck up out of the middle. He and Eustace took curved Caelermene swords and little round shields. There was no sword light enough for Jill, but he gave her a long, straight hunting knife, which might do for a sword in a pinch. "Hast thou any skill with the bow, maiden?" said Tyrion. "Nothing worth talking about," said Jill, blushing. "Scrub's not bad." "Don't believe her, sire," said Eustace. "We've both been practicing archery ever since we got back from Narnia last time, and she's about as good as me now. Not that either of us are all that much." Then Tyrion gave Jill a bow and a quiver full of arrows. The next business was to light a fire, for inside the tower it felt more like a cave than anything indoors, and set one shivering. But they got warm, gathering the wood. The sun was now at its highest, and when once the blaze was roaring up the chimney, the place began to look cheerful. Dinner was, however, a dull meal, for the best they could do was to pound up some of the hard biscuit which they had found in a locker and pour it into boiling water, with salt, to make a kind of porridge. And of course there was nothing to drink but water. "I wish I'd brought a packet of tea," said Jill. "Ooh, or a tin of cocoa," said Eustace. "A firkin or so of good wine in each of these towers would not have been amiss," said Tyrion. And that's the end of chapter 5. And help has come. Eustace and Jill. With the last time they've been in Narnia, or the last time we've seen them, saving Prince Rilian from the danger of the Green Witch and the Silver Chair. For them to be back in Narnia, and it's been, a year in the time of England, and hundreds of years in Tyrion's time, that Rilian, a great-grandfather? Maybe there's a couple of extra greats in there somewhere, but a good couple of 100 years have passed, as often happens as we go from one book to the next, where even the same children find out that everything is very, very different, and all of their experiences happened a long, long time ago, at least in Narnia. But in that darkest point from the last chapter, calling out and crying out and putting his only and last hope squarely in Aslan, help has come. That's the sort of encouragement I think it's good for all of us to remember. And sometimes we call out. We cry out even. We ask in prayer. Never knowing exactly what an answer might look like, how or through whom help could come. But rest assured, God hears us. God knows. God answers one way or another. Ways that we expect and ways that we don't. An answer that we like, or one that's a surprise. Maybe not in our timing, but always in His. Help will